Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melissa Deckman, the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute. I want to welcome you all to our webinar that's going to discuss the findings from our latest report, Mapping Christian Nationalism Across the 50 States, Insights from PRRI's 2025 American Values Atlas. We're very happy and delighted to be joining two wonderful guests with us today, Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Bryan Massingale, to discuss some of their findings, along with our president and founder, Robbie Jones. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage you to please submit questions you might have about the report in our Q&A box. We're going to do our best to get to those questions toward the end of the webinar. But again, please submit questions. And please make sure to visit our website, download the report. We have many more resources and information about Christian nationalism and about religion and American politics more generally. But first, I'm going to hand the baton to Ruth to allow her to introduce herself before we get started. Ruth.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here to discuss this incredibly important research. I'm a historian at New York University, the author of the book Strongmen. I publish a Substack called Lucid on threats to democracy. And I'm a specialist in particular in right-wing authoritarians and also looking at how faith institutions can be important in resistance against authoritarianism.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. And it's an honor to be with all of you and to discuss this really important and ongoing work that PRRI is doing. I teach at Fordham University. I'm a Catholic priest. I'm a theologian, a theological ethicist by specialization. I wrote the book Racial Justice and the Catholic Church. And my research focuses primarily on the ethics of racial justice from a faith standpoint. I also look at the intersections of race, sexuality, and faith. And those are the kind of major research focuses and teaching focuses that I have in my work as a Catholic priest and as a professor here at Fordham University.
Great. All right. Well, I will kick it off here. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Bryan, for being with us here today. We are huge fans of your work and your expertise, and are really grateful for you being here with us today. So my job is to kind of walk you through the findings of the report. I'm not going to get to everything, so this is just scratching the surface. Please do go to the chat, and you'll see the full link to the report, where we've got all kinds of tables and charts and explanations of all kinds of breakouts of the data. So there's much more there, maps, etc. Please do go there. I'm going to hit the high points, and then we'll turn it over for a little bit of a discussion. We'll hear from Ruth, we'll hear from Bryan, and then we will get to your questions. So please do put the questions in the Q&A slot, and we will get to them. You can go ahead and do that even while we're doing the presentation. We will get to them as soon as we go around the horn here. So I will start us off here. So what are we looking at? So this is the title of the report is Mapping Christian Nationalism Across the 50 States. This is a project that PRI has been doing since 2022. This is our next installment in that data, and our commitment to track these measures of Christian nationalism, not only at the national level, but all the way down to the state level. So how do we do that? You might ask. Well, you have to interview a lot of people to get state level data. Your typical political poll, for example, is about 1,000 people. This is 22,000 interviews that we've done to collect this data, and we were in the field, as you can see, really through the end of February all the way up through December of last year, collecting this data across the country. This gives us a small margin of error for the national sample. It's less than ±1 percentage point at the national level. And then we do have estimates for all 50 states. There is an appendix at the back of the report that's got all 50 states. You can see the sample size. You can see kind of the main measures by every state there. We do want to thank some foundations who made this possible. We want to be sure and thank the Wilbur and Hilda Glenn Family Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and of course the UUA Veach program at Shelter Rock. All right, so let me dive in here. So how do we measure Christian nationalism? So we are building on well over a decade of research done in political science and the social sciences, building on work by people such as Sam Perry, Andrew Whitehead, Phil Gorski, and others. These are the 5 questions that we use to measure Christian nationalism. So why do we use 5 questions? We use this to give us greater confidence in the measure. So we don't want to just use one question where people might be reacting in a certain way to the very particular thing that we have been asking. So these questions are also highly, highly correlated. We did a lot of testing, more than a dozen questions to see which questions actually kind of held together, and you can measure that statistically. These have a very, very high correlation. In other words, the way that people answer one question is highly predictive of the way they answer other questions. So you can see the kinds of questions here. I won't read them all, but from God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. That's a question that is kind of gets at this thing called the 7 Mountains Mandate and theological dominionism. And then down to questions like U.S. law should be based on Christian values, or being Christians an important part of being truly American. Again, it's how people answer all 5 of these questions that determines their score on the Christian nationalism scale, not just one. And when you do that, we basically end up with 4 categories. So these are our categories, to be clear. These terms, adherents, sympathizers, skeptics, and rejectors, are terms that we have kind of applied to each of these groups. But you can see that the adherents are the people who basically overwhelmingly or completely agree with all 5 of those statements. Sympathizers are those who basically agree with all 5 statements, but they don't agree as strongly as adherents. And then on the other side, we have skeptics, those who disagree, but are less likely than rejectors to completely disagree. And then the rejectors are the people who disagree completely with all 5 of those questions. So when we put those 4 categories together, this is what the country looks like at the national level. You'll see in a minute why we do this, but we tend to treat the first 2 groups together and the second 2 groups together. Adherents and sympathizers is basically people who lean into supporting this ideology and this idea of Christian nationalism, and then skeptics and rejectors, people who lean away from or disagree with that. So we have about 1 in 10 Americans, 11%, who qualify as Christian nationalism adherents. That is, they completely agree pretty much with all 5 of those questions. We have another 1 in 5 Americans, 21%, who are sympathizers. They agree, but not as strongly as those rejectors. So that means that we've got about a little less than a third of the country that is supporting this worldview. And then we have about twice as many Americans who are rejecting this worldview. 37% are skeptics, and 27% of the country are rejectors. So the other thing that we have been able to do since 2022 is we've been tracking this over time, multiple times per year. The nice thing about this is you can actually see how stable these measures are over time. So that has a couple of implications. A methodological one is that this gives us greater confidence in the measures, that we're not just measuring, for example, something that's responding to a news cycle or to an election event, something that's out in the environment, but we're measuring more of a kind of stable underlying worldview here. And that's what these measures show us. From a more substantive point of view, it also means that this worldview is not growing in adherence over time. It's remained fairly stable. So we're looking at something that is stable from a methodological point of view, and also not growing really from a substantive point of view in the country. So we're not seeing more believers in Christian nationalism over time. That is remain fairly steady. Now, what makes this survey unique is its size. Again, 22,000 plus interviews across the last year. This allows us to go all the way down to the state level. Here's one of my favorite things from the report is this heat map, where you can see every state and an estimate for the percent of residents of that state who are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. So we've kind of put those 2 categories together to render this heat map. Now, one of the things you'll notice is if I had colored this map red and blue instead of kind of blue and green, you would see the same patterns that you see on an electoral map, that kind of U-shaped curve that's usually red toward the middle of the country from national elections, where Republicans usually dominate, and then up through the Appalachian Mountains. You see that same pattern Here, the states that are highest, in fact, we have a couple of states here right in the deep South, Arkansas and Mississippi, for example, who have a majority of their residents who are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, along with West Virginia. You see standing out there. And then we see much lower measures, for example, in Massachusetts, only 15%, or California, only 22% of residents who are Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. So this tells you just at a glance how highly correlated these views are to our national politics. And we'll unpack this a little bit more, but you can just see it in the visual here. One other way to look at this is to look at favorability of President Trump. So this is a scatter plot that on the y-axis gives you Trump favorability. On the x-axis, it gives you the average score on the Christian nationalism of residents by state. You can see here, if you were doing a statistics textbook and you wanted a good example of a linear correlation in a scatter plot, this would make a pretty good example. You can see the trend line going through here, and all the states are clustered very tightly around this trend line. Basically just means the higher the score on the Christian nationalism scale for a state, the higher their favorability of Trump. Again, you can look at Mississippi and Arkansas that I drew your attention to in the previous one. There are those states out there on the right, also very high on Trump favorability. And take Massachusetts on the other side. It's the state furthest to the left and also one of the states lowest on Trump favorability. It's a very, very strong correlation between these two. So that's all sort of survey data that we can measure. We also decided to just see what would happen if we looked at a real world example. So this next chart shows you, we just looked at each state and the Republican makeup of its state legislature by the average score on the Christian nationalism scale. Again, very tight clustering around a linear trend line. It's not quite as tight, but it's still a very linear relationship between these two things. Again, the higher a state's residents are on their score in Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to have more Republican legislators in their state legislature. So let's unpack it a little bit about and see what demographic groups are most likely to support Christian nationalism. We'll start with party and media here. So first of all, you could see that this worldview of supporting Christian nationalism is the majority worldview of self-identified Republicans. This has been true since we have been measuring these attitudes. So for example, it is 56% of Republicans who are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. And you'll notice that this looks very different from independents and Democrats. And I think this is something I want to pause on here because we hear a lot about polarization, for example. And it is true that the country is polarized, for example, around adherence to Christian nationalism, but we are not evenly polarized. And I think that's the thing that is often misleading about that language of polarization. Political scientists usually attach an adjective in front of that, and they use the word asymmetric to describe the patterns that we tend to see in this data. So it's not evenly polarized, but we are asymmetrically polarized. What that basically means is that independents and Democrats, in other words, everyone else other than Republicans, look very different on these measures than Republicans do. So we have Republicans who are kind of outliers here. So again, it's 56% of Republicans, but it's really only a quarter of Democrats, and it's less than 1 in 5. Only a quarter of independents, and less than 1 in 5 Democrats who adhere to these views. And then you can see that we also see in terms of media, and our question asks people, who do you most trust to give you accurate information about current events and politics? And we see here that the things that come up to the top are people who say they most trust far-right news outlets like One American News, Newsmax, for example, really stand out. It's about 2/3 of that group that supports Christian nationalism. Fox News also stands out. 55% of that group are either adherents or sympathizers to Christian nationalism. Radio, which is dominated these days by really AM talk radio, is also kind of a place where the people who say they most trust that view are still majority Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. And then it kind of drops off from there. So you can really see the effect, particularly of kind of far-right news outlets, Fox News, and talk radio on these attributes. In terms of religion, this is Christian nationalism. So in terms of religion, this is the lay of the land. And what we see here is that one group in particular stands way out, And that is the group that is, of course, the base of the Republican Party, white evangelical Protestants. Again, it's 2/3 of that group who are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. In fact, 3 in 10 are full-on adherents, strongly agreeing with all 5 of those tenets of Christian nationalism. Right behind them are Latino Protestants. Again, a majority. It's the only other group that reaches a majority of either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. What they have in common is this group leans Republican. This group is also leans evangelical and charismatic. So they share this kind of evangelical and Republican leaning set of attributes, as well as Christian nationalism. Kind of all goes together. The LDS church is sort of divided on that. African American Protestants are right behind that, but a little more than 4 in 10, and then you can kind of see it dropping off from there. But the two that really stand out, white evangelical Protestants, Latino Protestants, both of whom Republican and evangelical leaning groups in the country. We also have found here that there's been some chatter, I think, that Christian nationalism is a phenomenon that is for people who are like Christian in name only. In other words, it's only sort of people who don't really go to church. This is not at all what we found in our study. In fact, we found that essentially these views are being reinforced by and are stronger among people who go to church at least once a week. And you can see this is true among white, black, and Latino Americans. It's especially strong among white Americans. 58% of those who attend at least once a week are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. So about 6 in 10 there. And you can also see this linear relationship that the less people attend religious services, the less likely they are to hold these Christian nationalist views. Finally, I want to look at a couple of things here about political violence and authoritarianism and how these two things link together. This is pretty interesting. We have been measuring support for political violence along with support for Christian nationalism over the years. We have always found that those who are Christian nationalism adherents are much more likely than those who are rejectors, for example, to support, say that they think we may have to resort to political violence in order to save the country because things are so off track in the country. You can see the trend here, and we put this dotted line in the chart to show what we have seen in this shift really since Trump was reelected. We've seen this drop in the number of Christian nationalism adherents in particular who say we may need to resort to violence in order to save the country. This is mostly obviously because they no longer believe things are so off track with Trump. But it's worth noting that even so, they are significantly more likely. In fact, they're 11 points more likely than Christian nationalism rejectors to support the possibility of political violence. We're saying we may have to resort to political violence. So even in this environment, the relationship still holds, although the gap really has narrowed. Then finally, I want to give you some things about immigration, because there's also strong anti-immigrant sentiment that runs through Christian nationalism. And this is where we see that really it's white Christian identity that correlates, as we saw on that chart, on white evangelicalism. And we see kind of white Christian identity really mixed up here with this sense of kind of anti-immigrant sentiment, willing to deport people, and here, and tied to authoritarianism, even willing to strip U.S. citizens of their citizenship and deport them if they are determined to be a threat to the country. Christian nationalism adherents very likely to say, and in fact, it's about 7 in 10 who are likely to say that yes, they agree that we should be able to strip U.S. citizens even of their citizenship if they're determined to be a threat to the country. And you can see again, it's linear. The less likely you are to believe in Christian nationalism, the less likely you are to support this kind of authoritarian tactic of keeping people in line. And then finally, on immigration attitudes. Here are a couple of examples. Immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. You can agree or disagree. This is essentially the great replacement theory that is often expressed by people on the right and in MAGA circles. Again, you see this linear pattern. It is 2/3 of adherents who say they agree or completely agree with the statement. It's only 8% of rejectors who say they agree or disagree with the sentiment. So this kind of anti-immigrant, great replacement theory that is kind of racially tinged, very strong in Christian nationalist circles. Also, these extreme rendition policies, strong support for that among Christian nationalists. Again, agreeing that the U.S. government should be able to deport undocumented immigrants to foreign prisons in El Salvador, Rwanda, or Libya. And we even had, without due process, without allowing them to challenge their deportation in court. Again, we have 6 in 10 adherents saying they agree with that, and even a majority of sympathizers saying they agree with that statement. Majorities of skeptics and rejectors disagreeing or opposing that such a policy. Birthright citizenship. Here again, we have the U.S. Constitution's existing guarantee that all children born in the U.S. automatically granting citizenship, and we have adherents less likely to agree, even with this constitutional provision, and rejectors overwhelmingly agreeing with that statement there at the end. And this one, again, I say this every time I'm presenting this in public. It is a statement that I just, as a pollster, did not think I would need to be writing. But here we are. The federal government should detain immigrants who are in the country illegally in internment camps until they can be deported. We have 7 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents agreeing with that statement. We have nearly 6 in 10 Christian nationalism sympathizers agreeing with that statement, and then it drops off after that. But again, this sense of these harsh tactics and that actually aren't supported by law, rendition without due process, concentration camps, and this underlying ideology of the Great Replacement theory, all very strongly correlated with Christian nationalism views in the country. So I will lay it off there and hand the ball off to first to Ruth Ben-Ghiat. So Professor Ben-Ghiat, thank you.
Okay, hello. Thank you for doing this survey. It's just so important. It's so rich. There's so many things that one can say about it. I just came from teaching my morning class at NYU on propaganda. So I will say that what we're dealing with here and what this survey captures, because it's admirably broad, it looks at media and many other factors and many issues, is that we're dealing with a culture, a worldview that is being ingrained, as the study shows, with those attending church services more frequently being immersed there, but also far-right media. And if you add up the statistics of far-right media, Fox News, talk radio, right-wing, it's significant. And so this is a group that is having their worldview have been radicalized and are being radicalized, but they're having these talking points that Robbie, you went over: immigration, use of violence, leader cult, all of this. They're immersed in this, and so one of the big questions is, how do we reach these people to encourage them to have different, more democratic points of view. The other is, of course, the overlap with authoritarian attitudes more generally. And we know from research that that those who already hold authoritarian attitudes about parenting, about schooling, about authority in the home or in society, and about religion, if somebody like a demagogue comes up, like a Trump or whoever, they are more easily activated politically. So they can be already authoritarian. And by the other token, when you see what kinds of faith institutions most readily collaborate with authoritarians, it's authoritarian leaning faith institutions to start with. And so what we see all over the world is more progressive faith institutions or interpretations of faith. These people and churches and faith groups, they become marginalized. And so again, you end up, and it's happened very fast here because, and it was going on even when Trump was not in office, of course. It's got long roots, but it's happened very fast in this past year to consolidate as a culture. And this last thing I'll say is this culture is giving a mandate for Trump's repression. That's one of the most disturbing things, with approving of camps, which are now being constructed, approving of, just identity politics, that they are not America, as well as chipping away at separation of church and state, which is a very old thing. And so it's very disturbing, but it just underscores the importance of developing strategies that are designed to reach this constituency, as well as supporting, since we're talking about Christian nationalism, Christians, especially from evangelical and Hispanic Protestant groups, who are doing something different, who are opposing this, who are giving progressive values. They need our support. And so that's, for the moment, what I have to say.
Well, first, thank PRI for this wonderfully detailed survey. That's really important. And I just want to, as a Catholic ethicist, raise 3 points initially. The first is to underscore something you said really early on, Robbie, and that is the country is not evenly polarized. I think we need to repeat that over and over and over again, that we're not talking about worldviews that have equal numbers on their side. We're talking about the fact that over twice as many Americans reject this worldview of Christian nationalism as support it. And I don't think that comes through enough. What that also means as an ethicist, we need to face the fact that the Republican Party is not representative of the country. It's not representative of the country. If 32% of Americans overall agree with white Christian nationalism, 56% of the Republican Party does. That means that party is no longer representative of the country as a whole, and yet it has a major, even a decisive influence upon our national policies and even our global identity. And so I think we need to really parse out, what does that mean when the ruling party no longer represents the consensus of the people? As an ethicist, as a Catholic ethicist, I want to point out that's really significant. Pope John Paul II said that the major question facing democratic societies is, how are we living together? And both of those words, we and together, are important. And increasingly, when you have a party that represents only a minority of America, that question is seen, I believe, as no longer even relevant or respected. That they don't, in a sense, care how we are living together, since they're not elected or have it in their worldview to represent the concerns of those who disagree with them. So that's the first thing I want to say. We're not evenly polarized, and we need to really lean into that and really understand, what does that really mean? It underscores the fraught nature of our public life together. The second thing I pick up from your survey as a Catholic is that only white evangelical Protestants and white Hispanic Protestants have a majority of their adherents respecting this worldview. And I think that's important for Catholics, because I think the Catholic narrative, especially after the election, where we saw that 59% of white Catholics supported Trump, that doesn't translate into respect and to support for the worldview of Christian nationalism. I think we need to understand that. And I think that what we see now is, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, a decrease in Catholic support overall for this president. And I think that's not at all accidental, that we can tie that to the new pontificate of Pope Leo the 14th, and also to the increased leadership of significant Catholic cardinals who are opposing the president on his immigration policies. I think we see in the Catholic Church, where in some dioceses, up to 50% of our parishioners are immigrants. That's going to have an impact upon Catholic participation and Catholic support for this current president and for the worldview of Christian nationalism. I think that also means that the news needs to be a bit more nuanced in painting people like Vice President Vance as being representative of a Catholic worldview. That he speaks for some Catholics, undoubtedly, but to say that he speaks for Catholics in general is not backed up by the research or by the evidence. And so I think I think it behooves us all to be very nuanced when we talk about Catholics and their support or not support for white Christian nationalism. And the third and final thing I want to raise is where Ruth kind of left off, and that is, how do we reach those who are adherents to the worldview of Christian nationalism? What we see is that, according to your report, only a minority of Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers get their news from newspapers or from mainstream media. And yet these are the venues that thought leaders who have a different point of view, these are kind of like our go-tos, and yet they're the least likely vehicles for reaching those who need to be converted. It also raises the question, and this is me as a minister speaking, is conversion even probable? Notice the way I phrased that. Not possible, because I believe as a good Christian, I believe that conversion is always possible. But I think we need to ask ourselves, how probable is it, and how effective can it be if those of us who have a different point of view express ourselves in venues such as podcasts or mainstream media or newspapers that are unlikely to reach the group that needs to be converted or needs to be changed. So those are my initial responses and observations. As you said, there's so much that's here. We could probably talk for days about it, but I'll stop at this point.
That's great. I just want to make a couple of comments just back to some of the issues that you raised here that kind of point back to the data. So one, Bryan, I appreciate you bringing up white Catholics and this gap between their support for Trump. Actually, every time he's been on the ballot, it's been almost 6 in 10 white Catholics that have voted for Trump every time he's been on the ballot. And yet, when you look at this core worldview, unlike white evangelicals, they look about like the country does on the scores of white Christian nationalism or on Christian nationalism. They don't look overwhelmingly on board. And so that gap, I think, between the sort of underlying engine and ideology and their support means that there is some, I think, room, right, for movement. And we're actually seeing, I think, some of that. The other group that's true for are the white non-evangelical Protestants. And I think that group often gets ignored, sometimes called the mainline Protestant group. That group has also voted about 6 in 10 for Trump every time he's been on the ballot, but not 8 in 10 or not 9 in 10, right, for Trump. And they also score much lower on the Christian nationalism scale. So if we're thinking, I guess, strategy or like where there might be places to hold the line, I think it is among white mainline Protestants or white non-evangelical Protestants and white Catholics, where there's actually already some looseness here and some ways where I think appeals might find more fertile ground, and even some places where I've been getting to say, wait, I didn't vote for this, when they're seeing some of the kind of harshest outcomes of some of this. The other thing to say about just non-representative of the GOP, this relative to this, is that one thing that's happened in the sorting of our two political parties since the civil rights movement, and that is when it started sorting, is that we now have two political parties that are heavily sorted on ethno-religious identity. They're segregated by race and religion. And so, for example, the Republican Party today is nearly 2/3 white and Christian, right? Self-identified Republicans, nearly 2/3 white and Christian. The country is 4 in 10 white and Christian. So that kind of non-representativeness on that side. So I think there's kind of, and that's one of the reasons why they look so different on public opinion surveys than the rest of the country, because there's been a kind of self-sorting, and the catalyst for that was actually response to Democrats being aligned with the civil rights movement, and then I guess the last thing I want to kind of pitch one question back to each of you real quick. So Ruth, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the ways you mentioned this. We've seen this echoed not just in the U.S. but in Europe, both in the past and in the present. I wonder if you just like flesh out just a little bit more, like how we're seeing some of these same claims and this kind of, particularly this marriage between right-wing authoritarianism and Christian nationalism, and like how those two things, actually feed each other.
Yeah, well, one of the vectors or the themes in which this gets expressed is great replacement theory. And the identity of the nation. And it's very important because, for authoritarians, polarization is only the beginning. What you really need is to what I call survivalism, where you work them into a state of thinking that the other is not just someone who thinks differently than you, but someone who poses an existential threat. And that's how you get people, you're moving along the indoctrination, radicalization, line. That's how you get them to embrace possibility of violence. And so there are different themes and narratives that are used, like the communists are going to get us. But great replacement theory is the prospect of white extinction. And in Italy, Meloni, the neo-fascist prime minister, her term was ethnic substitution. So, and this, they evoke ethnic cleansing, and that's what they're designed to do. And so this has, of course, now even it's becoming part of foreign policy, thanks to Vance and now Rubio, who goes to Munich, of all places, and talks, they're trying to get like the neo-Nazi party, which adheres to great replacement theory, mainstreamed. And he's talking about white civilization. And what comes to mind for me is Mussolini, who gets overshadowed by Hitler. In the 1920s, before Hitler even came to power, he was talking about what he would say is black, brown, and yellow people were submerging white people, that white people were going to become extinct because they weren't having babies. And so and white Christian civilization would be extinguished. And he said these things in words exactly the same as Orban. And now we have it, of course, officially sanctioned in a good way, approved of in the United States. And that is used, and it's not just an ideology, it's now becoming policy on immigration, on identity. Also, the reason that Hegseth is there, for example, a person of no experience, is because he was a Fox Business host. He's the Secretary of Defense, and he can tell lies smoothly, but he's a holy warrior. And so he's a Christian nationalist, a very rabid one. And so and he's said things in the past about population engineering. And so we also have Musk. All these people are coming together to create this culture of making aspects of great replacement theory into official policy. And of course, that's very worrying because whenever people are put into a state of mind where they see the other as an existential threat, that is when political violence and repression is approved of or accepted in a society.
And Bryan, just one quick one to you, and then we'll go to Q&A. I wonder if you'd say a little bit more about how this worldview sometimes expresses itself in something called Catholic integralism, and how that plays out in Catholic circles.
Okay. I'd be happy to. I just want to highlight something with Ruth that Ruth just said in terms of that great replacement theory becoming public policy. Note the number of times when we give public policy speeches, or even the national security strategy in the United States refers to civilizational erasure. Yeah. And what they're talking about here is the erasing of European white civilization. And how this has been now enshrined as a major concern in the national security strategy of the United States, an official document. So I just wanted to highlight that. In terms of Catholic integralism has a deep history. It basically refers to a worldview that says that societies should conform themselves as much as possible. Just society should conform itself to the moral teachings of the Catholic Church, and especially the moral teachings of the Catholic Church when it comes to issues of gender and sexuality. At least that's how Catholic integralism is now becoming reflected in modern day discourse, in contemporary discourse. And so the reason why that term's been thrown around a lot is that you see some conversations that Catholic integralism is somewhat adjacent to this worldview of white Christian nationalism. And I would say adjacent to, but not equivalent to. And I say not equivalent to for a couple of reasons. One is that, as you well know, Robbie, for a lot of American history, a lot of white evangelicals didn't look upon Catholics as being really Christian. And so I think we need to point that out. And that this marriage that's taking place between Catholic integralists and white Christian nationalists is really a marriage that's focused upon one common goal, and that is the shoring up of traditional gender sexual norms. And so Catholic integralists and white Christian nationalists will meet one another when it comes to issues like concern over abortion or concern over LGBTQ rights or concerns over trans equality. That's where you'll see this marriage of Catholic integralism, this belief that society should conform itself to Catholic beliefs on these issues, and white Christian nationalism. But that's a very uneasy marriage because they're coming to these conclusions from very different kinds of felt convictions. For example, white Christian nationalists would not necessarily want to conform themselves to Catholic teaching in all other areas. And so I think what we see here is a marriage that is unstable, it's adjacent, it's a marriage of political convenience, but it's not one that's inherently stable. And that's why you're getting Catholic pushback where you have Catholics that, as you said before, almost 6 in 10 will vote for Trump, but they're voting for Trump not because he's a nationalist. They're voting for him because of his perceived pro-life credentials. And I think what we're seeing is that as people find out more and more of his policies, especially when it comes to these immigration camps and these indiscriminate deportation policies, I think what Catholics are seeing is that he's not pro-life as we understand pro-life in a broader sense of the term. And I think that's what we see in Pope Leo pushing, and other Catholic bishops now pushing back on this narrative that Trump is somehow pro-life, when they're realizing that many of his policies don't advance the dignity of life. They don't advance human dignity across the board. And that being a fundamental bedrock conviction of Catholic social teaching, that's where you're going to see more and more, I believe, a parting of the ways between Catholic integralists and Christian nationalists. There is a definite marriage there. There is a definite overlap there, but it's not as seamless a connection as maybe the media or even Catholic integralists and Christian nationalists want to believe.
All right. Well, I'm turning it back over to Melissa, who's going to help us kind of parse the Q&A section there.
Actually, if you don't mind, I was going to talk a little bit about what
go ahead. Yep.
Say about the midterm elections. And in fact, a couple people have asked about the midterm. So I think it's kind of a nice segue to the Q&A. I think, I am a political scientist by training. I've looked very closely at the role of religion and influencing and shaping vote choice. And I think, as Robbie showed to you in one of our scatter plots, there's a very, very strong correlation between Christian nationalist views within states and their propensity to elect Republicans to state legislatures. Last year, we did a similar analysis where we saw a very strong relationship between Christian nationalist views within states and also propensity to vote for Donald Trump. That's a very, very clear connection that we have here that we're identifying. And so I think there are implications from this study looking ahead to November. I want to say this. So let's assume for a minute that the elections we will have in November are going to be free and fair. And I think maybe it's an assumption that we have to really kind of monitor, because we know, of course, that the current administration is looking in some ways to subvert the election with respect to trying to capture voter rolls. Trump has signaled his willingness or desire to nationalize some elections in some blue states. Of course, this is all unconstitutional. Nonetheless, let's just say that the elections go according to plan. What might our results have to say about the state of the Senate, for example? I'm not going to talk about the House as much because, we're not looking at those districts here. A lot of pundits who study elections say that the odds of Democrats taking control back of the House are pretty good. But I want to turn to the state of the Senate here. There are currently 35 Senate elections up for grabs this fall. And to be perfectly honest, it's a much more difficult road for Democrats to, in fact, become and regain a majority in the Senate this fall election. Currently, Republicans hold 53 seats in the U.S. Senate and Democrats hold 47. So they'd have to maintain every seat. Democrats have to maintain every seat and flip an additional 4 here. So if you go to the way that Senate elections right now are currently being ranked, there's a terrific website, 270 to Win, that kind of combines all these polls and state for state elections. We recognize that about 13 of those 35 states are controlled by Republicans, and they are solid and very safe. And notably, in every one of those 13 states, if you look at our heat map, they score well above the average when it comes to Christian nationalism in their viewpoints. Conversely, if you look at the 9 Democratic Senate seats that are up for grabs that are considered to be very safe for Democrats, they score well below the national average. Delaware kind of emerged a little bit this year, kind of an unusual trend there, but generally speaking, most of those states that are solidly Democratic have very few Christian nationalists within those states. And in fact, most of them, 3 in 4 residents, are Christian nationalist skeptics or rejectors. So that means people are focused on the states that are going to be more up for grabs or likely or leaning one party or the other. And if we look at the 6 states that are ranked as being likely or leaning toward the Republican Party, the 3 that are linked as relatively likely to go for Republicans are Nebraska, Texas, and Florida, which incidentally rank 16th, 17th, and 18th on our map of Christian nationalists in terms of viewpoints here. The 3 states that are leaning, though, are pretty interesting. They're Alaska, Iowa, and Ohio. And in those cases, those states, the averages in terms of Christian nationalist views kind of hew more toward the middle. Likewise, for Democrats, there are 2 that are considered to be likely or leaning. That's New Hampshire and Minnesota, where we have 2 incumbents who are retiring. Again, those states score well below the average in terms of Christian nationalist views. Finally, we have 4 open seats, or 4 that are just really too close to call right now. One of those is Maine, scores very low on Christian nationalist measures, and many people believe that Susan Collins, who's the current Republican senator, is the most vulnerable of all Republicans. We have North Carolina and Michigan. The only state that registers relatively high in terms of Christian nationalist views that's still considered too close to call right now is Georgia. That's because Jon Ossoff is running a very kind of vigorous reelection campaign. So that's interesting one to watch. So what is the larger takeaway then? If you think about Christian nationalist representation in all 50 states and statewide races here, I think it's very clear where Christian nationalists do not have a dominant presence, there is far more, I think, competitiveness in terms of those elections, right? And in close swing states, appeals to Christian nationalism are going to likely to be less successful. One state I wanted to point out here is North Carolina. Tom Tillis, who is viewed by some as a more moderate Republican, has kind of actually stood against Trump in many ways in the last year, has decided not to run for re-election. Democrats have basically are going to be nominating Roy Cooper, a very popular, moderate former Democratic governor. His likely opponent is someone named Michael Whatley, who has very strong Christian nationalist views. Last fall, was quoted as saying at an event, he doesn't see the need for the separation of church and state. Well, if you look back in 2024, that's a state that Trump won pretty handily, North Carolina, but the Republican gubernatorial nominee, who was Mark Robinson, who was extreme on Christian nationalist views, lost pretty handily. So I think understanding the spread of Christian nationalism within states really kind of helps to explain, I think, some of the dynamics that we see in some of these swing states. So I'm going to leave it at that and turn to some of the question and answers. We have a lot of very good question and answers here. So one is, I think, a question about, looking at scripture. And so we have, of course, a theology professor here. We have a former also seminary student in Robbie here. What are key scriptural supports for Christian nationalism that help to undergird sermons and messaging that concretize Christian nationalist political theology? So what is the religious case that some make for Christian nationalism?
Why don't you go for that, Robbie, since that's you kind of grew up in this worldview, so you've heard these appeals growing up. So I'll let you start from the lived experience.
Yeah. Well, I'll say they're not always grounded in scripture, despite claims to the other claims otherwise, even if they're embedded in a very scripture-centric tradition. But you'll see appeals to the state having the power of the sword and these kinds of authoritarian appeals. But they're actually rooted in something much kind of more cultural than that, and it is this old claim of seeing the U.S. in particular as a kind of promised land for European Christians. It's wrapped up in the U.S. in Manifest Destiny. And this word that we've already heard both Ruth and Bryan mention, civilization. You see this a lot, right? You'll see the Christianity and civilization. What they mean by that is whiteness, European Christianity, and civilization. Like that's the thing that's being protected. And I'll draw a through line between one other Q&A thing. They mentioned the KKK. And it's worth remembering that the KKK was not just a anti-black organization, a terrorist organization. Of course, they were that. But if you look at what were the positive requirements for being a member of the KKK, you had to be a white, European descent, Protestant Christian in order to be a member of the KKK. Because what they were protecting was exactly the things Ruth was talking about. They would use that language of race extinction. They were protecting against what they saw as the extinction of a white Christian country, right? So all of that language around Manifest Destiny, and frankly, we are seeing that rolled out before our eyes. If you go to the X account of the Department of Labor and the Department of Homeland Security right now, you will see the official state apparatus putting out images that just hold up this idea that this is a white Christian country. So you'll see it's an ethno-religious claim, and that has always been true, really, through the country. So I think it's actually not actually built that strongly on Scripture. It kind of uses Scripture sometimes as a cover, but it really is built on this much broader cultural tradition that's been with us since before the founding of the country. Right, this idea that these lands in North America were meant to be a promised land for European Christians.
If I can add to that, I think you're absolutely right, Robbie, that it's not necessarily founded on any one particular scripture or anything. It really goes back to this kind of founding ethos. I think of Jonathan Edwards' sermon that the United States is to be a city on a hill. It's a city on a hill because it's manifesting a particular kind of Christianity to the world, a very muscular, robust Christianity that is, you said, became the basis for Manifest Destiny, the basis for the doctrine that we can interfere in Latin American nations and countries. But the other thing I want to point out is that it's not necessarily a way of singling out scripture verses as much as it's a habit of how do you interpret or approach scripture in general. And in general, what happens in many evangelical circles, you approach scripture in terms of its implications for personal salvation and my individual relationship with Jesus. So when we hear things such as, I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. The way in which many evangelicals have interpreted those verses is say, that's what's incumbent upon me as a person, but it has no implication or relevance for how the government itself acts. And so therefore, I'm supposed to feed the hungry, but the government doesn't have any obligation towards its citizens to ensure that they can eat. I have a responsibility to be personally welcoming to immigrants and not speaking negatively about them myself, but the government has no obligation to treat immigrants with kindness or benevolence or respect. And so I think it's not so much looking for scriptural verses as much as it's a habit of interpreting these verses to apply only to personal behavior and not to social policy.
Yeah, that's right. It quarantines scripture, right, to personal attributes only, and then it leaves the state to run amok wielding the sword.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. We have a question here from a good friend of PRI, Diana Butler-Bass. She says, I'm wondering about constructing narratives that can appeal to, say, Christian patriotism without embracing Christian nationalism. It seems that there are many people in the white Catholic and white non-evangelical groups who would respond to appeals that affirm warm regard and appropriate love for one's country without giving into things like replacement theory. I've also seen a couple of questions. We mentioned the Senate, and so everyone is turning to James Tellerico, who's made some news in recent weeks, and even today. He was supposed to have an interview with Stephen Colbert about why he believes Christian nationalism is not actually rooted in Christianity. That was cut by and censored by the CBS News. So I'm just wondering, like, are there ways to appeal to those kind of what Robbie's often called the neglected religious meal that kind of talks about patriotism as opposed to nationalism? And really, I'd love to have anyone's views on that.
I could just say I've been writing since March or so about that the United States is living through a moral collapse. And in parallel to this deregulation of, because authoritarianism is about um, removing checks not only on regulations that prevent plundering the environment or the labor force, that kind of deregulation, but I think there's a parallel moral deregulation that goes on. So that's why you have criminals in office and you appoint officials who have sketchy or very compromised backgrounds. And so we're seeing many symptoms of moral collapse. And I think that this is a way to have and the Reverend Barber and many others are talking about moral rebuilding, moral fusion, moral renewal. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about this as well. And so this is an area I believe that that Christians and also secular people can come together in a patriotic way to save the nation and have the moral imperative. And that's also why Tallarico wasn't allowed to speak, because it's too threatening. Um, and they have to have the monopoly on this. So those are my 2 cents on this.
My 2 cents, coming from a Catholic worldview, is that I was asked this question about the difference between patriotism and nationalism from a Catholic point of view. And I went to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and I discovered that the Catechism of the Catholic Church talks about the need to have love for one's country and a critical allegiance to one's country, but it never uses the word patriotism.
Mm.
And I think the reason why it doesn't use the term patriotism is because patriotism, as we've seen all too often, can easily slide into an uncritical allegiance to one's nation. And patriotism becomes nationalism when an in-group asserts that it becomes a sole possessor or arbiter of what constitutes the nation. And so, like Reverend Barber and others, I talk about the need for a reconstruction of American identity, that we really need to, in the name of love for our country, a critical love of our country, really ask ourselves the question, who or what is America? And I think that becomes a very interesting question. Let's take something as recent as the Bad Bunny's halftime show at the Super Bowl and the mega freak out over it. And I think the mega freak out over it was that Bad Bunny was challenging or stretching the idea of who counts as an American, especially at the end where he says, God bless America. And then you see the flags of all of the countries of the American continent being present. And the very fact that you can say God bless America in the context of a halftime Super Bowl show that celebrates, Latino culture. I think this is a very important, pivotal question for us going forward. Who or what counts as American in America? And I think we really need to, especially as we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, becomes a very pivotal question that we have to finally ask ourselves. I mean, I think the question has now been called, as they would say in poker. We need to call the question, who or what constitutes America? And we see the answer from the other side very clearly. I mean, Robbie, when you talk about the Department of Labor posters, I've used those in my class. It's very clear when they talk about the American worker, they're talking about a white, male, heterosexual, buff, beefy, muscular. That's what constitutes America. That's what an American is. And I think the rest of us need to ask ourselves the question, who is being included in that vision? And more importantly, who's being excluded from that vision?
Robbie, I'm going to let you have the final word here.
Well, Bryan is, we've had to say you just gave a good invitation, Bryan, to kind of round out the service. But yeah, I'll just say, well, first of all, thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Ruth, not only for your perspectives that you brought here today, but for the ongoing, really important work that you are both individually doing with your own scholarship and kind of thought leadership in public. So thank you so much for that. And I think the last thing I'll say is a point that Bryan made. I was kind of bring it back around. Is that, if we're thinking about democracy, it's just worth saying this worldview of Christian nationalism it's antithetical to a pluralistic democracy. We just need to say that very clearly. The good news is that yes, we're polarized, but we are not evenly polarized. Let's kind of go back to that last point. There are twice as many Americans that support a view of a pluralistic democracy as embrace this kind of restrictive vision of Christian nationalism. And I think the task for all of us is to kind of lean in, right, to letting that be our answer who are we as America? And the answer has to be, it's all of us.
Well, on that note, we've had an incredibly active chat. I've never seen 30 questions before in a Q&A, and I think we need to host a second webinar just to get to them. But one final question was asked, how do we share this important work? So I'm going to tell you that please sign up for our newsletters, go to our website. We have a very vibrant Substack page as well, share on social media, consider supporting our work financially. I can go and donate on our website as well. But I wanted to thank everyone who participated today, Ruth and Bryan, for your wonderful thoughts, and also to those who participated in the Q&A. So thank you very much. And again, for more on this study, please go online to prri.org and you can read more analysis there. Thank you.
Thank you.